The vampire king came to the cottage at the edge of the world and laid his entire kingdom at the door. He had crossed the border forest. He had dismissed his guard. He had come without armor or crown, and the old man who opened the door looked at all of it, the power, the immortality, the impossible offer, and said, "She needs a good man, not a king." Nobody had refused him in 400 years. Nobody had been right in quite that way either. Autumn came late to the borderlands that year, and it came from the mountains rather than the sky, so that Black Hollow knew it first as a change in the quality of the dark, the shadows growing heavier, the tree line sharpening against the cold, before ever the first frost traced its fingers across the window panes of the village. It was a border place, and it knew what borders cost. The great kingdoms did not come here. Tax collectors came when the roads permitted. Vampire patrols came when it pleased them, and Castle Noctis stood above the forest on clear nights like a crown nobody had asked for, its towers lit with a cold light that was not moonlight and never had been. The village lived beneath it the way a man lives beneath a cliff, carefully without looking up more than necessary, and with the quiet dignity of people who have made their peace with a world that did not consider them at all. The houses here had learned to lock their warmth inside, the way the people had free fee, drawing the shutters early, banking what little heat they had against a darkness that gave nothing back. The smallest and the most deliberate of those houses stood at the end of the lane, set a little apart, with a kitchen garden behind it, where someone had fought the shadow of the tree line to a standstill and convinced a few stubborn things to grow. It had been a soldier's house once. It was a soldier's house still, though the man who kept it no longer carried a sword, only the posture of a man who once had and could not entirely put it down. The door was plain wood, but the hinges were oiled. The step was swept clean in weather that made sweeping pointless. Everything about it said the same quiet thing, the thing that pride says when it no longer has rank to say it with. We are not much, but we are honest. And that is not nothing. Inside it, on the morning Castle Noctis lit its towers before the sun had risen, Seraphina Ashcroft was on her knees beside a man from the next village whose fever had broken in the night, pressing a cloth to his brow with the careful efficiency of someone who had done this before and expected no thanks for doing it again. She was 23. She had been keeping this house since she was 16. Since the year the battlefield sent her father home with a limp and a silence he never fully broke. She was not a celebrated beauty. The village had not told her so aloud, but the great world had communicated it through its indifference, and she had received that message the way she received most things, as information, not injury. She had dark, curling hair, she wore simply, and steady brown eyes that missed very little, and a quality the village had come to depend on, even if it never found the words for it, which was that when something needed to be done, Seraphina Ashcroft was already there, doing it, quietly, without waiting to be asked. When old Marta's roof let in the winter, it was Seraphina who found the thatchers. When the apothecary's boy took the swamp sickness, it was Seraphina who sat the nights. She was not celebrated. She was relied upon, which in Black Hollow was the rarer thing, and she had long since made her peace with the difference. Her father came in from the yard as she was washing her hands, moving with the particular deliberateness of a man who has learned to negotiate with pain without showing it, favoring the knee that had never healed properly after the last campaign, the one whose name the border lords remembered and whose survivors did not. Garrick Ashcroft had been a knight, and a good one. He had served faithfully, been paid modestly, and been released at last with a wound, a modest pension, and the reputation among those who had stood beside him that no coin could have purchased, and that no lord had thought to reward. He was a broad, weathered, upright man, gone gray at the temples, with his daughter's eyes and a stillness about him that strangers read as hardness, and that those who knew him understood to be the discipline of a man who had buried things and refused to let them rise. He had loved one woman in his life. She had died. He had one daughter. He would have died for her before he would have said so aloud. He had one luxury, which was his principles. He could not afford them. He kept them anyway, the way a man in poverty keeps the one thing that costs him nothing except everything. You were up before the light, he said. The man's fever broke, she said without looking up from the basin. I wanted to be sure it held. He did not say anything for a moment. You should sleep, he said. I will, she said. After. He did not argue. He had learned not to argue with her judgment, which was sounder than his own in most matters that concerned the living. He had a soldier's certainty and none of a soldier's patience for the slow work of mercy, and he knew it, and was grateful that one of them did. He sat in his chair by the window and took up the old military map he was forever studying. Borders long since redrawn, campaigns long since finished. A habit of a man whose hands needed occupation now that they no longer carried a sword. And Seraphina watched him a moment, the careful gray head, the hands that had once carried a sword for the kingdom and now traced old borders on paper, and felt the thing she always felt watching him, which was love and fear in equal measure. Love for the man, fear for the day. Not far now, she thought, sometimes not far, when the pension would stop and the cottage would need more than her 2 hands could earn, and she would be a soldier's daughter with no soldier left to stand beside her. That was the first fear. The second fear was the one she did not speak, that she was already the thing the world had decided she was, useful, quiet, here, and that the worlds beyond the tree line would never look this far to see if that was all she was. This was the house. These were the people. This was the particular, principled, patient poverty of them. They did not know, on that ordinary morning, with the fever broken and the map spread out and the cold coming down from the mountains, they did not know that something old and enormous was already moving through the border forest toward them. They did not know that the great world was, at that very hour, preparing to offer them everything, and that the offer would be harder to survive than anything I had yet asked of them. King Lucien Dreadmore came to Black Hollow 3 days later, and he came, outwardly, alone. His kingdom lay beyond the forest. Castle Noctis rose from the mountain pass like a monument to the fact that some things are too old to explain. Its towers older than the border itself, its banners the crimson and black of a dynasty that had not changed its crest in 4 centuries. Lucien Dreadmore was older than anyone in Black Hollow knew to count. He was, by the reckoning of every kingdom that remembered him, the most dangerous thing alive. He had won wars that the histories called inevitable, only after he had won them. He had outlasted enemies who believed themselves permanent. He had everything that power accumulates when it is never seriously opposed. He had not always been cold. There were old servants in Castle Noctis who remembered something different, a younger king, before the thing that had closed him. But that was centuries gone, and the man who moved through Black Hollow's narrow lane that gray evening with the unhurried certainty of something that has never needed to hurry, was cold, or had learned so well to be cold that the difference no longer showed. He had silver-white hair worn long and pale eyes that had watched empires miscalculate, and a face that was striking in the way a blade is striking, precise, without warmth, made entirely for purpose. He stopped before Garrick Ashcroft's plain door. He looked at the swept step, the oiled hinges, the kitchen garden fighting the shadow, and something in him, some instinct he did not examine closely, recognized the language of that house, the pride that is run out of armor and is still standing. He did not yet know why it arrested him. He had come because of the girl. That was the reason he allowed himself. He had been wounded near the border forest a month before, traveling without escort, investigating reports of unrest, and someone had found him before his own people did. Someone without fear, or with too much principle to be governed by it. She had not asked his name. She had not recognized his face. She had simply done what needed doing and been gone before he could speak, leaving only the evidence of careful hands and the particular smell of border herbs that would not leave his memory. He had told himself he was coming to express gratitude. That was the duty. He told himself it was the whole of it. He was wrong, but he would not understand how wrong for a long time yet. Seraphina opened the door. The first thing she felt, looking up at the figure in the lane, pale, still, dressed in dark travel clothes that were too fine to belong to anyone ordinary, was not fear. It was recognition. She had sat with enough dying men to know the look of loneliness that has lasted so long it has stopped expecting company. This man carried it the way her father carried his wound, not displayed, not hidden, simply present, the way permanent things are present. He gave his name. She watched it land. She did not step back. She did not change expression. She said, "I wondered if you would come," and stepped aside to let something ancient into her father's small, ordinary house, as calmly as if old and terrible kings came up this lane every evening and went to fetch her father. He stood in the main room, low ceiling, flagstone floor, a fire that was more warmth than light, and saw the map spread on the table and the mended curtains, and a particular cleanliness of a place kept whole by effort rather than means, and felt, absurdly, less like a king than he had felt in 4 centuries inside his own castle. Garrick Ashcroft came in. The 2 men regarded each other, the ancient one and the weathered one, the one who owned everything and the one who owned almost nothing, and something moved between them that neither could have named. Not recognition of rank, recognition of cost. Garrick looked at him for a long moment. Then he said with the flat plainness of a man who has stopped pretending, "You're the one she found in the forest." It was not a question. It was not flattery. It was simply accurate. And Lucian Dreadmore, who had not been addressed without ceremony and longer than he could remember, found that this one plain sentence from this one poor, upright, unimpressed man went through 4 centuries of practiced coldness as though it were smoke, because it asked nothing, because it offered nothing but the truth, and because he had forgotten, somewhere in the long centuries, what that felt like. He had to look at the map on the table for a moment. That was how it began, not with the offer, not with the kingdom he would later lay at her feet, not with the crimson banners, or the ancient crest, or the immortal power. It began with a man who looked at him without bowing, in a house that smelled of wood smoke and border herbs, and told him only what was true. The offer came later, and the offer was Lucian's mistake, the mistake of an immortal king who had lived so long inside his own power that he had forgotten there was any other language. He came back, of course. He told himself it was courtesy. A king does not come once to the house of the woman who saved him and never returns. And he came back through that cold autumn more often than courtesy required, and each time he stayed longer, and each time he left more unwilling. He came to know them, the old soldier and his principles, the daughter and her quiet, relentless usefulness, the cottage that had more warmth in its 4 small rooms than Castle Noctis had managed in 400 years. But that knowledge came slowly, the way trust comes when it has been earned. Before any of it, before the offer, before the refusal, before the words that would shake both kingdoms, there was a village at the edge of the vampire lands and 2 people living in it, with nothing remarkable about them except their character. That is where the story begins. In Black Hollow, beneath the shadow of Castle Noctis, on the night Seraphina Ashcroft went into the border forest and found something she was not supposed to find, and helped it anyway. She found him bleeding in the forbidden forest and asked no questions. By dawn, he was gone. He left only one thing behind, a black signet ring bearing the crest of Veleberin, the crest of the vampire king. She had saved the most dangerous creature alive, and she didn't even know his name, but he knew hers now, and he would not forget it. If you want to find out what happens when the vampire king comes back, not wounded, not hiding, but in full power with his banners and his crown and something he has never offered anyone, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Chapter 2 is already waiting for you. Don't let someone else tell you how this ends first. He came back 4 days later. He told himself it was courtesy. A man of his standing did not accept help and vanish without acknowledgement. There were forms to these things, obligations. He had simply come to discharge one. He wore plain travel clothes, good wool, dark, unremarkable, and left his horse at the edge of the village where the lane narrowed. He gave no name at the first house he passed. He walked like a man accustomed to arriving places without announcement, and then remembered, halfway down the lane, that he was supposed to be someone who was not. He slowed his pace. He had not slowed his pace for anything in 4 centuries. Serafina was in the kitchen garden when he came through the gate, cutting back the last of the autumn herbs before the frost took them. She looked up without surprise, without the particular performance of surprise that people usually offered him, the sharp intake of breath, the sudden straightening, and simply said, "I thought you might." "Might what?" "Come back." She set down her shears. Men who leave without saying anything usually have something they meant to say. He had prepared a speech, gratitude, formally expressed. Brief, he had given versions of it to generals and ambassadors and once to a pope. It had never felt inadequate before. He said, "I wanted to thank you properly." She looked at him for a moment with those steady brown eyes that seemed to be doing arithmetic. "All right," she said. "Come in then. My father will want to take your measure." Garrick Ashcroft took his measure immediately and did not like what he found. He was civil about it. He was always civil. He had the soldier's gift for courtesy that costs nothing and concedes nothing, and he used it precisely, offering the chair by the fire, pouring the second cup, asking the questions a host is expected to ask about roads and weather and the length of the journey. But his eyes did not move from the stranger's hands. A man who had spent 20 years reading other men in the field knew the hands, how they rested, whether they were still from ease or from discipline, whether the stillness was the kind that came from having nothing to fear, or the kind that came from being the thing other things feared. This man's hands were still in the second way. "You travel alone," Garrick said. It was not a question. "Often," the stranger said. "That's either very foolish," Garrick said, "or very confident." The stranger looked at him. "Yes," he said simply. Garrick refilled his own cup and said nothing more, but he watched. Serafina showed him the village that afternoon, the way she showed everyone things, without performance, without apology, just the plain fact of it. She showed him the family whose roof had not survived the last vampire raid, the widow who had lost 3 goats to a patrol that had taken them, she was told, as tribute, the children who had learned to come inside before dark, not because their mothers told them to, but because they had already learned what dark meant on the border. She did not narrate any of it with anger or with grief. She simply let him see. He walked beside her and said very little. He had walked through capitals and throne rooms and ancient battlefields, and he had not felt what he felt walking through this one small failing village, which was the specific discomfort of a man encountering the cost of himself. She did not know that. She was not saying it to accuse him. That was almost worse. "You're not afraid of me," he said at one point. She considered this honestly. "I was, a little, in the forest, when I didn't know what you were." A pause. "I'm less so now." "Why?" "Because you're still here," she said. "Things that mean harm don't usually stay for the afternoon." He did not know what to do with that. He stored it the way he had been storing everything about her. The directness, the absence of calculation, the way she moved through her world as though it had asked something of her and she had simply agreed. The attack came at dusk. 3 of them, rogue, unbound, the kind that the court produced when discipline failed, came through the northern end of the village fast and without warning. There were screams. A cart overturned. A man went down. What happened next was very quick and not entirely visible. The stranger was simply there, between the 3 of them and the family that had nowhere to run, and then the 3 of them were not a problem anymore. He did not draw a weapon. He did not require one. When it was over, he was standing very still in the middle of the lane with the particular stillness he had, the kind that was not peace. Garrick stood 10 feet away. He had seen enough. The 2 men looked at each other across the smoking dark. "You are no ordinary man," Garrick said. The stranger looked back at him. The pretense had run out, and both of them knew it. "No," he said quietly. I am not. He came back a week later. This time he did not slow his pace. Black Hollow knew something was wrong before it saw what. The horses came first. Not the sound of them, but the feeling a low tremor in the ground that the village recognized in its bones. The way border people recognize everything dangerous. Too late to do much about it. Early enough to get inside. Then the torches appeared at the tree line. 12 riders in the crimson and black of Castle Noctis, bearing the Velebran crest on banners that caught the wind with the particular authority of things that have never needed permission. They did not ride fast. They did not need to. They came the way a tide comes, not rushing, simply arriving, inevitable and indifferent to whatever stood in the way. And at the front of them, unhurried, silver-haired, dressed in a crimson-black cloak that moved like something alive, was the man who had sat in Garrick Ashcroft's kitchen 4 days ago and drunk his tea without ceremony. Doors closed up the lane. Shutters followed. A child was pulled inside mid-sentence. He stopped before the cottage. He did not dismount immediately. He sat for a moment in the full light of the moon and the torches, and let the village understand what he was. Then he stepped down and knocked. Seraphina opened the door. She had heard the horses. She had looked through the shutter and seen the banners and felt something drop through her. Not fear, exactly, or not only fear, but the particular vertigo of a thing that has been true for some time, becoming suddenly undeniable. She had known since the lane, since the stillness after the attack, and the way he had looked at her father, and the way her father had looked back. She had simply not known the full size of it. She opened the door and let him in. He was formal in a way he had not been before. He stood in the center of the small room, too large for it, suddenly, where before he had simply seemed tall, and he addressed her father with the particular precision of a man delivering something he has prepared. Garrick stood by the fire. He did not sit. Lucian said that he had come to ask for Seraphina's hand. Then he made his case. He offered protection. Not the fragile kind that depended on good weather and the goodwill of border lords, but the absolute kind. The kind that 4 centuries of unchallenged power could guarantee. He offered wealth enough that the cottage and its careful economies would become a memory she could afford to find charming. He offered with the directness of a man who saw no reason to be indirect about facts, the extension of her life, years beyond what any human woman could expect. Beside a man who did not age and did not die, he offered peace between Velebran and the human settlements, a formal treaty, an end to the raids, the patrols, the tribute, the particular grinding fear that Black Hollow had lived beneath for 3 generations. He laid each thing down the way a general lays out a campaign, methodically, completely, leaving no gap through which doubt could enter. And then, because he believed it was the largest thing he possessed and therefore the largest thing he could give, he offered the kingdom itself, Velebran, Castle Noctis. 4 centuries of accumulated power and wealth and consequence settled on Seraphina as a wedding gift to do with as she judged right. He had never offered anyone anything larger. He waited. Seraphina stood very still through all of it. She was not unmoved. She would not pretend that. He was not a man anyone stood near without feeling the weight of him, the age, the certainty, the dark pull of something that had survived everything and intended to survive more. But she was watching his face as he spoke, and what she saw was a man who had reached for the largest things he owned and arranged them carefully between himself and the answer he was afraid of. The way a man builds a wall not to keep others out, but to keep his own uncertainty in. He did not once say, "I love you." He said, "I will give you everything." And she understood, with a sadness she had not expected to feel, that for him, those were the same sentence. Garrick stepped forward. He had not moved until that moment. He had stood by the fire with the stillness he always had, the one that strangers mistook for coldness, and that those who knew him understood was the discipline of a man holding something carefully. He moved between them. He looked at Lucy and Dreadmore. The silver hair, the ancient eyes, the kingdom's worth of offerings still hanging in the air between them. And he refused, flatly, completely, without hesitation. Lucian stared at him. "What more?" he said, with the genuine incomprehension of a man who has never been told no and cannot locate the logic of it. "Could a father want?" Garrick looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "She needs a good man, not a king." The room went very quiet. Lucian could have commanded him. He could have burned the cottage to the ground and taken what he came for and called it his right. Because for 4 centuries it would have been. He did none of those things. He stood in the silence Garrick's words had made, and felt them go somewhere they could not be argued with, and turned and walked out. The banners followed him into the dark. The village did not come out until morning. He rode back to Castle Noctis in silence. His court knew better than to speak to him when he returned that way. The 12 riders peeling off to their posts without a word, the doors opening before he reached them. The corridors clearing as though the castle itself had learned to read his silences over the centuries and act accordingly. He went to his study. He sat. He was not angry. That was the thing that troubled him most. He had expected anger, had braced for it on the ride back. The familiar heat of a will that had not been opposed in 400 years, meeting the hard edge of refusal. He knew what his anger felt like. He had governed kingdoms with it. It did not come. What came instead was something quieter and considerably worse. She needs a good man, not a king. He sat with it the way you sit with a wound that has not yet begun to hurt, knowing it will, waiting, unable to do anything in the interval but understand its shape. What troubled him was not the refusal. It was that he could not find the flaw in it. The court found him the next morning. They came with the careful energy of people who have been waiting for permission to say something and have decided collectively that enough time has passed. Lord Vere came first, as he usually did, a lean, pale man of perhaps 3 centuries who had the particular talent of making his ambitions sound like concern. He said that the king had been seen, that the village had seen the banners, had seen the king refused, had seen him leave without consequence. That word traveled on the border. That a king who could be told no by a penniless former soldier was a king whose borders would shortly be tested by people with considerably larger armies. He said all of this with great delicacy and the eyes of a man keeping score. Then he said that the human girl had clearly worked some influence over the king's judgment and that the court was worried naturally only for the king's sake, and perhaps some distance from the border villages would be advisable until his clarity returned. Lucian looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Leave." Vere left. The court followed. The corridors filled again, briefly, with the sound of people finding reasons to be elsewhere. Lucian sat alone in the large, cold, magnificent room and thought about what Vere had said, and about what Garrick had said, and about the difference between the two. Vere had spoken of appearances, of power and how it looked to those watching. Garrick had spoken of nothing but the truth. He had not even spoken it unkindly. That was the part Lucian kept returning to. There had been no contempt in it, no triumph. Just a plain man saying a plain thing, the way you tell someone their coat is misbuttoned. Not to humiliate, but because it is true and they should know it. She needs a good man. He turned the sentence over, and for the first time in a very long time he asked himself honestly whether he was one. He went back to Black Hollow 12 days later. No banners, no riders. Plain clothes, plain horse, nothing about him to distinguish him from any other traveler on the border road except the stillness, which he could not entirely put aside. Garrick opened the door and looked at him without surprise. "I did not come to ask again," Lucian said. "I know," Garrick said. He stood back. "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. No fire. Mid-morning. The plain light of an overcast autumn coming through the window. And Lucian asked the question he had ridden 12 days to ask. How does a man become worthy? Garrick was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table, the scarred knuckles, the careful stillness of them. "You won't like the answer," he said. "I rarely like useful things," Lucien said. "Tell me anyway." Garrick looked up. "Start with someone who can give you nothing in return," he said. "Do something for them. Don't tell anyone. Do it again." That was all. No philosophy, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that what he was prescribing to one of the oldest and most powerful beings alive was an afternoon's labor in a poor village. Lucien nodded once and left. What followed was not dramatic. That was the point. He came to understand. It was roofing timber for the family whose house the last raid had opened to the sky. It was riding off 3 of his own court's strays at the northern pass before they reached the market road. It was medicine. Good medicine. The kind Castle Noctis had in abundance, and Black Hollow had never been able to afford, left at the apothecary's door without a name attached. He did not announce any of it. The village noticed anyway. Villages always did. But they noticed the way they noticed weather, as a fact about their world, not yet something they had words for. Serafina noticed too. She said nothing to him about it directly. That was not her way. But she walked beside him sometimes in the evenings when he came through, and she asked him questions that were not small talk, about what he had seen, what he thought, what 4 centuries felt like from the inside. He answered her honestly. He had not spoken honestly to anyone in a very long time. It was, he discovered, a more difficult thing than ruling a kingdom, and considerably more worth doing. The stories reached Castle Noctis before Lucien did, most mornings. That was how courts worked. Information was currency, and the court of the Bellabrin had been trading in it for centuries, shaping it, withholding it, releasing it at the moment of maximum effect. Lucien had always known this. He had built his reign partly on it. He had not anticipated being its subject. The stories were not false exactly. That was Ver's particular gift. He did not invent. He was selected. He took the true things, the timber, the medicine, the strays turned back at the northern pass, and he arranged them in a light that made them look like symptoms. The king has grown soft. The king has forgotten what he is. There is a human woman at the border, and she has her hand around his judgment. The court did not rebel loudly. Courts of that age and experience did not. They shifted. They went quiet in certain rooms when Lucien entered. They asked careful questions about succession. They began, in the small, deliberate way of people preparing for a change in weather, to cultivate Lord Ver. Lucien saw it. He said nothing. He had governed long enough to know that naming a thing too early only taught it to hide better. He watched and waited, and went back to Black Hollow twice more that month, and did what Garrick had told him to do. That was his mistake. Not the mercy, but the patience. He had assumed Ver would move slowly. The incident at the Eastern Road happened on a Tuesday. 3 vampire soldiers, Velebrin livery, Velebrin crests, were found at the road's edge, roughed up and disarmed, their horses gone. By the time the report reached the castle, it had already acquired a shape, a Black Hollow mob, human villagers, an organized ambush. It was clean work. Ver had always been clean. Lucien looked at the report and knew it for what it was within the first reading. The Eastern Road did not pass within 4 miles of Black Hollow. The villagers there did not own horses worth stealing, and the 3 soldiers in question were men Ver had personally assigned to Border Patrol 6 weeks prior. He summoned the court. He told them he would not act against Black Hollow. He told them he had read the report, had noted its inconsistencies, and that he would be investigating the matter himself before any punitive action was considered. The room was very quiet when he finished. Ver said, with the careful sorrow of a man performing reluctance, "My lord, the court cannot continue to watch the kingdom's authority go unanswered. The court," Lucien said, "will watch whatever I tell it to watch." He left. He rode for the border that afternoon. He arrived to find the cottage empty, not abandoned. The fire was recent. The morning's work still on the table. Garrick's map open to the border pass, just empty. in the way a place is empty when the people in it left quickly and did not plan to. Garrick was in the lane. He had his sword out, the old one, the border steel he kept oiled out of habit and had not carried in years. His face was the face of a man who has done his arithmetic and arrived at a number he does not like. "They took her an hour ago," he said. "4 of them. Valebrin livery." He said it without accusation. That was the thing about Garrick. Even now, even here, he reported rather than blamed. He was a soldier giving information to the person best positioned to use it. Lucien stood very still. "Which road?" he said. "Castle Road, North Pass." Lucien looked at him. The age, the wound in the knee, the sword held with the steadiness of a man who had never entirely stopped being what he was trained to be. "You cannot keep that pace," Lucien said. "Then you'll have to slow yours," Garrick said, and moved. They did not speak much on the road. There was nothing useful to say, and both of them understood that. Garrick rode with the economical grimness of a man spending reserves he had been saving for something important and had decided this qualified. Lucien rode beside him and did not push ahead, though he could have. Once, at the midpoint, Garrick looked at him sideways. "You're angry," he said. "Yes. How angry?" Lucien was quiet for a moment. The horse moved beneath him. The castle road wound upward to the dark pines, the towers of Noctis just visible above the tree line, lit against the night sky. "Angry enough to do something I would regret," he said. "I am aware of that," Garrick grunted. It was not approved exactly. It was the sound a man makes when an answer is better than he expected. They rode on. The castle gates came into view as the moon reached its height, open, which was wrong, and lit with more torches than a normal night required, which was worse. Lucien pulled up. He looked at the gates, at the banners, at the number of lights moving in the upper corridors. "This is not for soldiers acting alone," Garrick said quietly beside him. "No," Lucien said. He had known Vere was moving. He had not known how far the movement had already gone. The castle that had been his for 4 centuries looked back at him in the torchlight, patient and indifferent, waiting to see what he would do. They went in through the eastern servants' gate. Lucien knew every entrance to Castle Noctis the way a man knows his own skeleton, not by thinking about it, but because it was simply part of what he was. He had built 3 of the walls himself in a century when building was faster than negotiating. He knew which corridors the torches missed and which staircases the guards considered beneath their notice. He moved through his own castle like a ghost, and Garrick moved behind him with the quiet of a man who had learned long ago that silence was a weapon as reliable as steel. They found the loyal ones in the lower corridors. 6 of the old guard who had served before Vere's influence had reached the barracks. A steward who had been barricaded in the wine cellar since morning with the particular expression of a man who has decided that history can sort itself out without him. Lucien spoke to them briefly and quietly, and they listened the way people listen when they have been waiting for someone to tell them what they already knew they needed to do. Then a door opened above them and the castle became loud. Vere had chosen the great hall. Of course he had. Vere understood theater. He had arranged the court along the walls, those who had joined him standing, those who had not kneeling, and Seraphina at the center of it, which was a statement about what this was really about. She was not bound. That was the first thing Lucien saw. She was standing with her hands at her sides and her chin level, looking at Vere with the particular expression she had, the one that was not defiance exactly, but the absolute refusal to perform the fear that was expected of her. She had worn it in the lane when she opened the door to him the first time. She was wearing it now in a room full of ancient and dangerous things, and it was having roughly the same effect. Vere turned when Lucien entered. He had prepared a speech. It was a good one. Lucien could tell from the first sentence the measured cadence of something rehearsed. He spoke about the kingdom, about what Valebrin was and what it had always been, about the nature of power and the cost of softness, and the human woman who had compromised a 4-century reign in the space of 1 autumn. He offered Lucien the choice: surrender the girl, Return to what you were. Rule as you ruled before, through the only language that lasts. Or keep her and lose everything else." The court watched. Lucian let the speech finish. Then he said, "No." What followed was not clean. Battles inside stone buildings rarely are. There were 12 of Vare's men against 6 of the old guard and 1 aging border knight and 1 king who had not fought in earnest in 60 years, but had not forgotten how, and the math was close enough that it mattered how it started. It started with Garrick. He took the first one before Vare's men had finished processing the fact that Lucian had brought a human soldier into the throne room. And he did it with the economical violence of someone who has long since stopped being impressed by size or speed and simply works the geometry. It took 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. Seraphina did not wait to be retrieved. She had spent the hours of her captivity doing what she always did, observing, cataloging, understanding the room. She knew which of the kneeling courtiers were kneeling from fear rather than allegiance. She had spoken to 2 of them quietly when Vare's attention was elsewhere. When the fighting started, she moved toward them and said the thing that needed saying, plainly, without ceremony. "He is going to lose. Be on the right side of it." They were. Vare was good. Lucian had always known that, had kept him close partly for that reason. The way you keep dangerous things where you can see them. He was fast, and he was old, and he fought with the precision of someone who had been studying this particular opponent for decades. But he had made the mistake that ambitious men always made. He had planned for the king Lucian had been. He had not planned for the king Lucian was becoming. Lucian disarmed him against the far wall with a finality that left no question about the outcome, and stood over him with Vare's sword at his throat and the court watching from the edges of the room, and felt the rage, clean and very old and entirely justified, and held it. He held it for a long moment. Then he stepped back. He addressed the court the way he had always addressed them, without theater, without anger, in the voice of a man stating facts. He named what Vare had done, the framing, the soldiers, the kidnapping. He named the ones who had joined it, and the ones who had not, and he told the former they would answer for it through the law rather than his temper, which was a mercy they had not extended to anyone and did not deserve. Then he declared the new law. Valabrin would not be governed by terror, not of its king, not of its nobles, not of the dark it had spent centuries convincing humans to fear. That era was finished. The room was silent. Garrick stood near the door, sword lowered, breathing carefully around what was probably a cracked rib. He looked at Lucian across the length of the hall, not at the king, at the man. He said nothing. He did not need to, but something in his face, the careful, weathered, never easily given face of a soldier who had spent a lifetime distinguishing between men who deserved trust and men who merely demanded it, had changed. And Lucian saw it, and it meant more than the throne had in a very long time. 3 weeks passed before he went back. He spent them doing what needed doing. The court reorganized. Vare's conspirators processed through the law as promised. The border patrols recalled and reissued under officers he trusted, rather than officers who had trusted Vare. There was administrative work of the kind that followed any significant shift in power, and he did it thoroughly and without complaint because it was the unglamorous machinery of the thing he had declared, and declaring was the easy part. He knew that now. He had always known how to rule. He was learning, slowly and with difficulty, how to be ruled by something other than his own will, by the weight of what other people needed, by the particular discipline of a man who has decided that his first instinct is not always his best one, and has committed to the work of finding out what lies beneath it. It was harder than anything he had done in 4 centuries. He went back to Black Hollow on a gray morning, alone. No banners. No horse worth remarking on. The plain dark coat he had worn the second time he came, before the truth of him was visible. He did not dress as a king because he was not coming as one. He was coming as himself, which was a thing he was still learning to locate. Garrick opened the door before he knocked. He had been watching from the window. Lucian had noticed the curtain, and he stood in the doorway with the familiar stillness reading him the way he always did. The quick soldier's assessment that took in everything and showed nothing. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him because he stepped back and said, "She's in the garden." Serafina was cutting the last of the winter herbs, the ones that survived frost because they had decided to, the stubborn ones. She heard him come through the gate and turned and looked at him for a moment without speaking. She had been doing that since the great hall, looking at him a beat longer than before, as though she was checking something, measuring the distance between what he had been and what he was becoming. He had not rushed her. He had not sent word ahead or arranged the meeting or given her any reason to be here that was not entirely her own choice. She was here. He stood in the kitchen garden where everything was gray and stripped back and honest, and he said, "The first time I came to this house, I brought you a kingdom. You brought it for yourself," she said without heat, "to feel like it was enough." "Yes," he said, "I know that now." He had not planned to kneel. It was not a calculated gesture. He had not rehearsed this the way he had rehearsed the first proposal, had not arranged the words into their most effective order. He simply found himself on one knee in the frost-hardened earth of her father's garden because it was the only position that felt accurate to what he was trying to say. He told her the truth, that the first proposal had been pride wearing the costume of devotion, that he had confused the size of an offering with the depth of a feeling, and that a man who had spent 4 centuries being given everything he asked for had not known the difference until someone had the courage to show him. That he could not offer perfection, that he had centuries of habits that would require centuries of work, that he was not a simple man and would not pretend to be one, but he could offer honesty, patience, the specific protection of someone who would place her safety above his pride, which for him was not a small thing. A lifetime spent trying daily to be worth the answer he was hoping for. He was not asking to own her future. He was asking if she was willing to be part of it. The garden was quiet. Serafina looked at him for a long moment, the steady brown eyes doing their arithmetic, the same calculation she had been running since the lane, since the forest, since the great hall when she had watched him step back from Vere and choose mercy over satisfaction. "That," she said quietly, "is the first thing you've said to me that didn't have a price on it." She reached down and took his hand. Garrick was in the doorway. He had been there long enough to have heard most of it. He made no pretense otherwise. He stood with his arms crossed and his expression doing the careful work of a man who has made a decision and is not going to perform uncertainty about it for anyone's benefit. He looked at Lucian for a long moment. Then he said, "You'll take no orders, Will." "No," Lucian agreed. "You'll have to be argued with, regularly." "I expect so, and you'll listen." It was not a question. "I will," Lucian said. "I have been practicing." Something moved in Garrick's face. Not a smile. Not quite. But the thing that lives in the same neighborhood as one, the thing that a man allows himself when the world has done something he was not certain it had in it. He unfolded his arms. "Then you have my blessing," he said. "God help you both." Castle Noctis did not change overnight. Old things do not. The towers were still dark and the banners were still crimson, and the mountains were still the mountains, cold and indifferent and ancient beyond any kingdom's memory. The court was still full of people who had spent centuries learning to navigate power and were still deciding what to make of a king who had started behaving like a man. But things changed, slowly, practically, in the way that real changes happen, not in declarations but in the 10,000 small decisions that follow them. The medicine kept going to the border villages. The patrols were recalled from the ones that had served no purpose but intimidation. The great hall, which had been a room for the performance of power, became on certain evenings a room where humans and vampires sat across tables from each other and talked about the border and the winter and what the next year might reasonably ask of both of them. Serafina was the reason most of them came. She had the quality she had always had, the one the village had known and the great world had never seen, of being entirely, restfully reliable. She did not perform diplomacy. She simply treated everyone in the room as though their concerns were worth hearing, which in Castle Noctis was radical enough to pass for genius. Garrick came too, Lucian had asked him, with the specific humility of a man who knows what he lacks and has identified the person most likely to supply it. He sat at the end of the table and said very little, and when he spoke, people listened because he had the gift of plainness, of saying the true thing in the fewest words, without ornament, without agenda. He told Lucian once, in the corridor after a particularly difficult session with the border lords, "You did well there." Lucian looked at him. "You hesitated before you said that," he said. "I always hesitate," Garrick said. "It's called thinking." He paused. "You did well." It was, Lucian reflected, the highest praise he had received in 4 centuries. He found that he believed it more than all the rest. This is what the story was when it was finished. Not a king who won a woman with a kingdom. A man who was told he was not enough and believed it and decided to do something about it. The crown was still there. The immortality was still there. The ancient cold power of Veleberin and Castle Noctis and 400 years of unchallenged authority. None of that had gone anywhere, but none of it was the point anymore. The point was the kitchen garden in the frost, the plain wooden door with the oiled hinges, the old soldier who had looked at the most powerful thing alive and told it the truth because his daughter deserved nothing less. The point was that love cannot be offered like a kingdom on a platter. It cannot be commanded or purchased or proved by the size of the gesture. It can only be earned, slowly, honestly, in the small repeated acts of a person who has decided that becoming worthy is worth more than being powerful. Lucian Dreadmore had ruled for 4 centuries. He had been learning for 1 autumn and 1 winter how to be a man. The second thing, it turned out, was harder. And the only one that mattered,